I used to believe that my family was unshakable, a fortress built on years of love, trust, and sacrifice. To the outside world, we looked enviable, my wife, radiant even in her quiet moments, my son, ambitious and full of restless energy, and me, a husband and father content in the ordinary rhythms of life. Yet beneath the polished surface of our home, a fracture was forming, one that I did not see until it was too late. My wife, Lena, was the type of woman people admired from a distance. She carried herself with a kind of grace that made her presence feel reassuring, almost maternal, even to strangers. For years, she had been my anchor, gentle, attentive, and seemingly devoted. But lately, I had noticed something subtle shift in her. She smiled less when I spoke, lingered longer on her phone, and seemed to inhabit her own private world even when sitting beside me. I told myself it was stress, that every marriage had its seasons of distance. I wanted to believe that. Our son, Daniel, had always been close to his mother. That bond was something I had encouraged, even envied. Where I was stern and measured, she was warm and forgiving, and he gravitated toward that softness. Daniel had grown into a confident young man, brimming with independence, but also carrying a streak of rebellion. He was quick to challenge me, often siding with his mother during minor disagreements, a pattern I had brushed off as typical of his age. Still, I sometimes felt like the odd one out in my own family, an outsider watching their closeness from across the dinner table. Evenings in our household followed a familiar script. I would return from work, exhausted yet grateful to step into a home filled with life. We would share meals, talk about Daniel's plans, and laugh at stories Lena told. At least, that was how it used to be. More recently, those dinners had grown quieter. Lena would steal glances at her phone, smiling faintly at messages she never shared with me. Daniel, too, seemed distracted, his eyes darting between us as though holding back thoughts he could not speak aloud. I began to notice the little things. Lena staying up late in the living room after I went to bed, Daniel lingering in her company long after our conversations had died. There were whispered exchanges I wasn't meant to hear, laughter that faded the moment I entered the room. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid, but the unease grew heavier with each passing night. Still, I clung to the illusion of stability, convincing myself that families endure storms and that mine was no different. Yet somewhere deep inside, a part of me recognized the truth. The bond one had trusted so completely was changing in ways I could not yet name. I didn't know it then, but the cracks I ignored would soon widen into something irreparable. And once I saw what had been unfolding under my own roof, I could never see my family the same way again. Suspicion is a quiet poison. It doesn't arrive all at once but seeps in slowly, filling the spaces between words, shadowing every glance, every silence. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself Lena was simply tired, that Daniel was preoccupied with his own life. But when the same unease grows sharper day by day, denial becomes harder to hold on to. I began noticing patterns. Lena's phone never left her side anymore. She guarded it with an intensity that felt uncharacteristic, even intrusive. At dinner, she would smile faintly at her screen, brushing it off as just a message from a friend. Daniel, too, seemed unusually protective of her, answering questions on her behalf, or changing the subject when I pressed too far. They spoke in half-finished sentences, exchanged glances that lingered longer than necessary, and shared private laughter I could never access. It was in those moments that a knot began to form in my chest. Something was wrong, and no matter how I rationalized it, the signs refused to fade. One night, I returned home earlier than usual. The house was dimly lit, the air heavy with silence. I moved quietly, my footsteps muffled by the carpet, and heard voices drifting from the living room. At first, I thought it was ordinary, mother and son sharing a late conversation, but the tone stopped me cold. There was a tenderness in Lena's voice, a softness I hadn't heard in months. Daniel's reply carried a familiarity that was far too intimate, far too knowing. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding as though warning me to turn away. Yet I couldn't. I leaned closer, straining to catch their words, each one cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't what they said exactly, but the way they spoke, like two people who shared a secret the world must never know. Summoning what little courage I had, I stepped into the room. They both turned, startled, their faces pale, eyes wide with something that was not just surprise but guilt. In that suspended moment, silence screamed louder than words. On the coffee table lay Lena's phone, its screen still glowing. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. My hands trembled as I scrolled, reading messages that shattered the foundation of everything I believed about my family. Words of affection, of desire, written not by a stranger but by my own son. Each sentence burned, each confirmation tearing away a piece of me. Lena tried to speak, her voice breaking, but I couldn't hear her. Daniel shifted uneasily, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between us. The air was thick with shame, heavy with betrayal, and I stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. In that instant, the world I had built collapsed. My wife was not who I thought she was. My son was not who I had raised him to be. And I, husband, father, provider, was left with nothing but the unbearable truth that the two people I trusted most had crossed a boundary no family should ever cross. The hours after that discovery are a blur, yet every second is carved into me with unbearable clarity. I remember the stillness of the room, the way Lena's face crumpled into tears, the way Daniel clenched his fists as though preparing for a fight that could never be won. I didn't shout, though part of me wanted to. I didn't strike, though rage boiled hot in my veins. Instead, I stood there, hollow, as if my body had been emptied of everything but disbelief. When words finally came, they were quiet, trembling, almost unrecognizable as my own. Why? It was all I could manage. One question, simple yet impossible. Lena's lips parted, but her excuses faltered before they formed. Daniel looked away, ashamed but defiant, as though torn between guilt and some twisted justification. Their silence was its own confession, louder than any admission could have been. I retreated into myself in the days that followed. The house that once felt like a sanctuary became suffocating, every corner echoing with memories now poisoned. At the dinner table, no one spoke. Meals sat untouched, forks clinking against plates in a silence that felt heavier than shouting ever could. At night, I lay awake, staring into the darkness, haunted by images I never wanted in my mind. Confrontation was inevitable. One evening, I asked Lena to sit across from me. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but her tears did not move me. I wanted answers, and yet every word she spoke felt hollow. She claimed confusion, weakness, loneliness, but none of it justified the betrayal. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I had once loved her touch. Now it repulsed me. My talk with Daniel was even more unbearable. He avoided my gaze, shifting uncomfortably like a boy caught in a childish lie, yet this was no childish mistake. His explanations stumbled into arrogance, then regret, then silence. I searched his face for the son I had raised, the boy who once held my hand crossing the street, the child who used to run to me after school. But he was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. Beyond our walls, the world carried on as if nothing had changed. Friends called, neighbors waved, coworkers asked about my weekend, and I smiled weakly, hiding a wound they could never see. The shame was too heavy to share, the story too grotesque to tell. This was a secret I carried alone, and its weight threatened to crush me. Inside, a war raged. Part of me longed to destroy everything, to leave, to expose them, to burn the remnants of this false family to ash. Another part of me, quieter but insistent, clung to denial, begging for a way to undo what I had witnessed. But there is no undoing, no erasing. Once trust is broken in such a way, it cannot be mended. I realized then that betrayal doesn't just wound, it reshapes. I was no longer the man I had been before that night. My home was no longer my refuge. My family was no longer my own. And nothing, not time, not forgiveness, not love, could make it whole again. In the aftermath of betrayal, time moves strangely. Some days crawl, each second heavy with grief. Others vanish in a haze of numbness, as though my body moves but my mind remains elsewhere. I found myself drifting through life, performing tasks out of habit, but nothing felt real anymore. Even the air in my home seemed tainted, every wall a reminder of what had unfolded within it. I made a decision, though calling it a decision feels misleading. It was less a choice and more a surrender to inevitability. I could no longer live among the ghosts of trust that once held us together. So I packed my things quietly, methodically, avoiding Lena's tearful eyes and Daniel's hollow silence. I left behind not just a house, but an entire version of myself, a man who once believed his family was unbreakable. Lena tried to stop me. She pleaded, her voice cracking, her hands trembling as she reached for me. She spoke of mistakes, of forgiveness, of starting over. But her words rang empty. They echoed in a place where love had been gutted, where only ashes remained. Daniel, on the other hand, said little. He stood in the doorway, watching me with a mix of defiance and sorrow. Perhaps he wanted to explain, perhaps he wanted to apologize, but I could not give him the chance. His silence became the last word between us. In the weeks that followed, solitude became both punishment and refuge. I wandered through days without direction, haunted by questions I could never answer. How had I missed the signs? How could the people I loved most betray me so deeply? Was there something broken in me that had allowed this to happen? These thoughts circled endlessly, offering no relief. Yet in the quiet of isolation, a strange clarity began to form. I realized that betrayal does not define the betrayed, it defines the betrayer. What Lena and Daniel chose was not a reflection of my worth, but of their weakness. I was not the architect of this tragedy. I was its witness, its victim. And though the wound would remain, I refused to let it consume the last fragments of who I was. Life, after such a fracture, is not a clean slate. It is a landscape scarred, reshaped by fire. Trust is no longer something I offer freely. Love is no longer something I assume is safe. But in those scars lies a hard-won truth: resilience. Humans endure even when they should not. We learn to walk through wreckage, carrying the weight of what we've lost, yet still moving forward. I do not pretend to know what future awaits me. Perhaps loneliness will be my companion. Perhaps, in time, I will discover something resembling peace. But I know this: what was broken cannot be mended, and what was lost cannot be returned. Some stories do not end with reconciliation. Some end with survival. And survival, painful though it may be, is its own form of victory.